Welcome to a joint podcast of Ascends at Boston Avenue and Committing Faith in Public. My name is Philip Boone, and my co-host is Caitlin Drake. Before we begin, I'd like to state that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church.
Today, our guests are Senior Pastor at Boston Avenue, Reverend David Wiggs, and the Director of the Center for Religion and Public Life, Dr. Gary Peluso-Verdend. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great to be here.
And today we're going to talk about keeping the church relevant in kind of a shifting culture. So David, you had a really good example or metaphor for this.
Right. So recently I saw a speaker had a slide, told the story of this elegant and beautiful and well-constructed bridge they had built over a chasm to help people navigate from one population to another. Then they had a hurricane, and the bridge was over a river. And after the hurricane, the river relocated its path and was no longer under the bridge. So now they have a beautiful bridge, well constructed, ready to use. But because the river moved, so did the population. And so now they have basically a bridge that nobody uses because it's a bridge to nowhere. And she was using that to illustrate what has happened with the church, is that we have built an institution that was well constructed and served well at one point in its life, and now the culture has shifted and people are no longer coming to church the way they used to and are not accessing how they have their spiritual needs the way they used to, and the church is struggling to figure out how to move to be able to be relevant to folks.
Culture is always seems to be changing. Why is church so reluctant to change?
Probably for all kinds of reasons, but in the recent sexual morality debate, what I see is that the church ends up being in a position of defending traditional morality, and they've staked so much on their defense that when even people in the church think we ought to change, they've invested so much in the historical position that they're reluctant to make the move. Gary may have a whole nother take on that.
No, just I would piggyback on that and align with that. So first story that came to mind was an old-time seminary professor who said, I used to ask youth, does God understand radar? And of course radar now is, so it's got to understand computers, And he said their first response usually was no, that God doesn't understand radar, because I think in a lot of people's minds, God is associated with something in the past. God is associated with set ways of doing things, with golden ages and the like, and it's very different from a perception that things change, that God, in fact, may in some way change. So, all of our Greek philosophical categories, God is immutable and all-powerful, and there's a lot of the church has thought over time, God doesn't have anything that's the equivalent of godly emotion. Right? That emotion's a human thing, or the gods of Olympus or the like, but not a God who actually feels, which of course is incredibly different from the God presented either in the Hebrew Bible or that Jesus presents. So I think it's the association of religion with things past and golden ages and kind of a set something that has been broken in here today, but it was right sometime in the past.
Right, which would explain why any kind of change in the church can be difficult if the mindset of people has to do with, we know the answer because God gave it to us, so if it's a change, it must be contrary to God, rather than looking at the part of Scripture where God is always doing new things, and so maybe this is a movement of God's Spirit that's causing the change rather than something contrary.
And it's not only the Catholic Church that over time has said, we have an eternal truth, and we're teaching what you're teaching you now is eternal truth. This has always been true. It will always be true. And oftentimes those eternal truths wind up, there's that hymn that says something along the lines of "Time makes ancient truths uncouth," right? So that's also going on. If you say authoritatively, this is the way it is and always has been and always will be, and then things change. What does that do to the authority of that teaching? It undermines it.
So beyond even the theology, because I think that there is definitely that theological piece, but even just structurally, being on staff at a church, I've noticed that change is not always well received, whether it's changing the start of a service time or
one of the worst.
or even a smaller change of where a piece of furniture is located, or it seems like there is a reluctance to change, and how do you navigate that, either in a leadership role or in a professorial role? How do we prepare ourselves to deal with change?
A lot of different ways. I like the Buddhist analogy or the Buddhist story that if you sit in a chair for an hour, you might be comfortable. If you sit in a chair for 4 hours, you might start getting uncomfortable. If you sit in a chair for a month straight, you're likely to become disabled. So that continuation of what is, just exactly where it is not in fact the way that life even works. Would be one way of thinking about it. Another is one business consultant had talked about the difference between change and transition. That change is the carpet gets changed in its color. The pipes in the pipe organ get taken out; they get brought back in. You change a service time. That's change. Something. Transition is everything that happens between your two ears, or collectively in a congregation, everything that happens. And transitions take a lot longer than change does. So, and part of it, and this person says, a huge reason why a lot of strategic change in organizations fails is that leadership does not pay sufficient attention to the transitions necessary to go along with that change. And I can attest to, I have failed in that numerous times, underestimating how much time one must actually spend with the anxieties and other things that accompany transition.
Well, that would be tied to the ability of people to change or their comfort with change. We know quite a bit about whether it's in the church or other arenas of people who like variety and are often early adopters of some kind of change, whether it's technology or new worship style. And then there's another group that are slower to change, and there's another group that fights it, almost to the death. And so I think so often as leaders, as pastors, we sort of assume whatever our comfort level is with change is the congregation's comfort level. Right. That's just never true, because you're not in three different places, you're in one. So if there's really a variety of responses, not to take that into consideration is to always stumble in the midst of a change or a transition, realizing, if you don't realize that there's different segments and different ways people embrace change, then you don't make sufficient time for them to navigate the transition, or for the whole group to actually make a move to be able to affirm something altogether.
Gary, can you tell us what the role of seminary might be in order to prepare for change?
Always a difficulty in talking about any school, because schools are not known for turning on a dime themselves. And in fact, that's part, again, because we have these libraries and we have these accumulations of wisdom from the past, with the huge difficulty that technology has changed all of our lives. And it has driven change in far beyond what most of us are able to catch up with, as a matter of fact. So seminary education, which is graduate professional education in preparation for ministry of a variety of sorts, you start by dealing with ancient texts. And one of the biggest factors in any seminary education is but how is your school approaching those texts? And one of the things that I find is that a seminary has to be also attentive to its faculty over time, because newer faculty bring in different perspectives than previous faculty had. So there was the historical critical method of dealing with Scripture that has been in some ways eclipsed by post-colonial perspectives and numerous interpretations that come from non-white, non-European audiences and the like. Really important that we get our comfort level with change up as faculty and administrators. I mean, that's one way of handling it. But another, I guess, one of the ways is, and this is more abstract than I can give you real specifics on. A huge question for all of us is, tell us about, for every professor, is tell us about the church you're preparing ministers for. And I certainly was well prepared when I graduated seminary in 1981 to pastor a church of 250 in worship attendance that had a full-time pastor, maybe a full-time or at least a part-time program, a person of some sort, full-time custodian, the church that almost entirely has disappeared from the landscape in the last 40 years. So the way I say it is we need to be preparing whoever comes through seminary, we need to be preparing them for making a way where a way might not currently exist, rather than preparing them for the churches that currently exist, and for a career that, who can predict what a career in ministry looks like these days? If you can sketch out what you think the church is going to look like in 40 years, and be accurate about that, man, at some point in your life you're going to have made a lot of money, because you can't sketch that out. So how to be nimble, your comfort level with change, your comfort level with dealing with other people's anxieties, which is the biggest obstacle to really accepting any kind of change, is really people's anxieties. Those are the kinds of things I think, either we should be, or we should be even spending more time with in seminary education, in addition to the basic knowledges of how to interpret Scripture, how to interpret a context, and then how much of the other disciplines you need in order to flesh out your education.
So thinking to this context of a changing culture, I think a huge factor for churches is shifting church attendance and the demographics around that. So I'm a millennial. My generation is famous for killing things, different industries, different attitudes, different values. And it's been thrown that millennials are killing church, that they're not going to church. And I certainly didn't go to church for a decade plus. How do we, look at that shift in demographics and adjust ministry accordingly? Mm-hmm. Or how do we think about that? And oftentimes as a young adult in the church, I'll have people approach me and say, we need more people like you. Why aren't there more people like you here? How would you answer that for my generation? What do you think it is?
Well, I think a lot of it is what we've said, is that we were designed and geared in another time period for other generations. It worked well for a long time. And we know our churches in the U.S. are populated largely by middle to older adults to begin with. So they're dealing, when we talk about change, they're also dealing with their own grief and loss of what they were comfortable with and what they remember as the church, particularly in terms of worship and worship styles and how many people come and how often they come. So we're having to reinterpret a lot of that. I was just with a group of pastors of large United Methodist churches a week or so ago. All of us are dealing with the same thing, is the church used to evaluate the effectiveness of a pastor on how many members a church had. So if you had a big membership number, that was a real positive. Mm-hmm. It's shifted to, well, people don't join organizations the way they used to, so we will count how many come to worship every week. So we have an average weekly worship attendance. And so that was the sort of measuring stick. What we were all talking about is that even our people who are committed, who identify themselves as members, as active members, as loving their church, don't come to church every week. They may not even make it once a month. They come when they can, and it's probably, once a month is maybe the average or something close to that. And so what we were discussing, is it a more accurate measure of how we're reaching people for Christ if we look at how many different people participated, whether it's in worship or a Bible study or any number of things. How many different people did we engage over a month or over a quarter or maybe even over a whole year? So I may have a worship attendance of 500 or 1,000, but I may have engaged 2 or 3 or 4,000 people over the course of a quarter or a year. But that's hard to make those shifts. It's hard to know how we count. Another example is also with the rise of technology and digital platforms. If you measure only the people in the building and not people who are watching online or watching through television or accessing a sermon or a worship service on YouTube or some other platform, then you really discount that that's a valid way to have spiritual needs met. Even though we don't discount it, we don't say it's an invalid way to do your Christmas shopping or to read a book or to do any number of other things that we do online. Oh, that's okay. That's just a change. But often in the church, we somehow disqualify the newer ways of accessing God or accessing a spiritual community. And so I think we have to think through all that. And in terms of young adults, right, we don't see them in the sanctuary as often as we did baby boomers. We have to recognize cultures change. They may be actually spiritually at 25 or 28, they may be much more committed to their faith. They might be much deeper involved in their spiritual life or even in serving in the name of Christ. They don't come through us, so we don't maybe see it, or they don't come to worship. They just show up for the clean up the park day that we do or whatever. And I think we haven't, where the leadership of the church hasn't made the shift, is we haven't learned even what we ought to be noticing or measuring to figure out who are we helping? And that's really the question. Are we helping people on their spiritual journey? Are we helping them to be followers of Christ? If the answer is yes to that, then that's a valid thing to measure.
When you talk about things that we measure, one of the memories that will probably stick with me forever, I had been on staff for a very short time, and this conversation came up in a meeting about why aren't there young people? And somebody said that if people are not in worship on a Sunday morning, if they're not in sanctuary on a Sunday morning, then they are not in a right relationship with God. And to hear somebody next to me who was responsible for the spiritual nourishment of other people, and I mean, I felt personally attacked by that.
Sure.
I know that was not their intention. But I think that framework as a young person is one that doesn't sit well with me, that my spiritual nourishment most often does not come in a sanctuary. So from that lens, where are other places? You mentioned, doing mission work, that we may see a lot more people there than we do in the sanctuary seat. What are some other kind of fresh models of ministry or innovative ministries that you see a more flexible or adaptive church utilizing?
Let me comment on that in a second, but I want to come back to, I think what David just said, I want to underline it because it's the importance of engagement and how you measure engagement. And the old measure of, showing up in worship, okay, but how engaged were people showing up in worship? What were the outcomes of them showing up in worship? How did that increase? How did it help them increase love of God and neighbor? I mean, that's how you get to things like engagement. So finding some measures for engagement, I think, is absolutely critical. I think what I see is in terms of trying to reach those who aren't in church is breaking the shift. It's breaking the pattern from you all should come here to, well, where are people that we need to go there. I think, on the one hand you have the Life Church TVs and type of huge, they still have some kind of attraction model going on, and people will come out to a site. But then I also see a whole lot of what I refer to as organic experiments. They're smaller, but they're looking for where do people naturally gather. And what can we do that engages with them? And that's where I think that, the pub theology or what happens in a playhouse or movie theater or the like, or finding a noontime group and all. These are becoming, I think, really, really important for people because they tend to include face-to-face, and a desire to learn and grow that has both an educational component to it as well as let's make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and go to underneath the bridges and hand them out.
Because we had that attraction model and everybody comes to the main campus or the main building or the however you identified that in the past. Part of the shift is going to where the people are. Part of the shift, I think, that we haven't made yet, that we're in the midst of, though. We've made some efforts for this at Boston Avenue and other places, is how do we put resources in the hands of people to help them grow spiritually with their friends, with their family, and their own reflection time. But we don't know how to measure that. Yeah. So as a hierarchy or as leadership or people trying to supervise and measure effectiveness, if I say, well, I gave out 150 calendars for spiritual growth for this month, that's important. If people took that, I feel good about that. They don't know how to count that. They don't know how to evaluate that because I don't follow all 150 people, so I don't know how they used it or what impact it had on their life, or did they share it with a neighbor or a friend, or are they using it for their family dinner devotion? We don't really know. So we're kind of trusting the Holy Spirit at that point to be at work through those resources. But I think it's a much more contemporary model that people, what I've noticed at Boston Avenue in the last 6 years is the more I can put in somebody's hand to take with them, the more excited they are about their faith. I don't always know how they use it. I'm sure not everybody uses it. I know I take resources. Sometimes they feed me, sometimes they don't. And nobody knows that because it's my personal devotion time unless I tell them. But certainly it's a valid way to do discipleship, to do spiritual growth and spiritual formation. It's not the way we've always done it.
Yeah, and I would say that one of the reasons is because a lot of people like the introspective look and they want more devotion and more personal devotional time, but they're not 100% sure where to go. Mm-hmm. So giving them something like that gives them something in their hand that they can go, and it gives them a thing to do each day to devote to God and just be more introspective as well.
And I want to just say one thing about that, which is I want to come back to there's a difference between inputs and outputs. And I think we in the church and a lot of organizations, a lot of businesses are a whole lot better at measuring the inputs. Mm-hmm. How many pieces of publicity did we put out? How many calls to discipleship did we make, and all that kind of thing? And we're not like the churches that have the belt buckle marks for how many converts, because everything is around the new convert to Christ sort of thing. But how do you measure then what did people do with that? How can we sample that? How can we get a feel for what we're doing is effective or not? Those are really, really important questions. And again, you're not asking those questions when it's the 1950s and early 60s and there's so many people coming you don't know what to do with them.
Right.
You are asking those questions when you know the model needs to change, which usually means the inputs need to change and what you're measuring may need to change also.
Do you have anything else that either one of you would like to add?
I have one thing, which is one of what the churches have been excellent at for the last 200 years in this country is acquiring property and building structures and then maintaining those structures, maybe even well past when there was a mission still to have it for some of them. Boston Avenue is not in that category, but for some of them, which means we have an enormous amount of money invested in property that served that model of a church where you went there. Now with the church more in an era where the movement seems to be, how do we go out? I think one of the huge opportunities and dilemmas we have is how we translate all that money that's invested in these properties into doing mission and ministry in ways that make sense today.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been the Committing Faith in Public podcast, which Dr. Gary Peluso-Verdend hosts, and the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. We are located, Boston Avenue is at 1301 South Boston Avenue in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please check out our social media for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.